Hello, welcome to the Heartbreak Stories channel. Today's story is about a man who heard something that should have broken him, and instead he quietly built something his wife never saw coming. Now let's listen.
Mid-argument, my wife blurted she was in love with someone else, then spent the next hour chasing me through the house, swearing she made it up. I said nothing, because the name she didn't mean to drop told me everything, and I'd already started building something she'd never see coming. My name is Preston Turner. I'm 44 years old. I work as an industrial boiler maintenance specialist for a regional utility contractor out of Columbus, Ohio. It's not glamorous work. You show up before dawn, you troubleshoot equipment that could take your hand off if you look at it wrong, and you fix things other people don't want to deal with. I was good at it. Still am. The problem was I brought that same fix-it mindset home and applied it to a marriage that Naomi had already mentally checked out of, while I was still under the hood trying to figure out what was making the noise. We'd been married 11 years. No kids. They used to bother me more than it did by the end. Looking back, maybe it was a mercy. It was a Tuesday in late October when everything detonated. I remember because I just come off a double shift at the Hardrow plant, and my boots were still muddy when I walked through the front door. Naomi was in the kitchen, arms folded, jaw tight. She had that look, the coiled spring look that meant she'd been rehearsing something all day. It started over dishes. Of all the ridiculous things, she said I never pulled my weight around the house, that she was tired of being invisible, that I treated the apartment like a hotel. I stood there with my jacket half off, too tired to argue and too stubborn to apologize for something I hadn't done. And that's when the fuse hit the powder. You know what? She snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I don't even care anymore. I'm in love with someone else. The room went dead quiet. I heard the refrigerator hum. I heard a car pass outside. I stood very still. She stared at me like she was waiting for a detonation, like she'd lobbed a grenade and expected the walls to come down. Instead, I picked up my jacket from the floor, hung it on the hook by the door, and walked to the kitchen sink to wash my hands. Preston. Her voice followed me down the hall. Say something. I didn't. I dried my hands, set the towel on the counter, and headed toward the bedroom. That's when she started chasing me through the house. And I mean that almost literally. She followed me from the kitchen to the hallway to the bedroom doorway, her voice climbing with every step. I didn't mean it. It wasn't true. I was just angry. Preston, stop walking away from me. I turned around slowly, looked at her standing in the doorway, chest heaving, eyes wild, backpedaling on words she'd chosen with her whole chest 2 minutes ago. You said what you said, I told her, keeping my voice even. It was just an argument, she insisted, throwing her hands up. People say things they don't mean when they're angry. You know that, do they? I replied, because that one came out pretty clean. No stambid, no hosetaschen. Her mouth opened and closed. She shifted tactics, voice softening, hands reaching out. I made it up to get a reaction. That's all. I just needed you to feel something. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I nodded once, not in agreement, just in acknowledgement, and closed the bedroom door between us. She knocked twice. I didn't answer. That night, I lay on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling with my boots still on, thinking about the word someone. Not nobody, not nothing. Someone. You don't blurt a word that's specific by accident. You don't reach for that particular weapon unless you've been carrying it for a while, keeping it sharp, waiting for the right fight. I didn't sleep, but I wasn't broken either. I was calculating. By the time the sun came up, and I heard Naomi moving around in the kitchen, making coffee, pretending the previous night was a weather event that had already passed, I'd already started taking inventory. 11 years, 1 mortgage, 2 cars, a joint account, and 1 sentence, 6 words long, that she wanted to walk back like it was a parking ticket. I showered, got dressed, and came out to find a plate of eggs on the table and a smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. I thought we could talk, she offered. Sure, I said, sitting down. Pass the salt. She blinked, sat down slowly across from me. Watched me eat like she was trying to figure out what kind of animal I'd become overnight. The truth was, I hadn't become anything. I'd just finally woken up. The next 3 days ran on routine. I got up at 5, made coffee, went to work, came home, ate, went to bed in the guest room. Naomi tried twice to restart the conversation. Both times I gave her the same thing, polite, measured nothing. Not the silent treatment. Just a door she couldn't find the handle on. She didn't like that. Naomi was built for reaction. She needed the push-pull, the argument that circled back and eventually landed somewhere she could manage. My stillness threw her. I watched her recalibrate in real time, shifting from guilt to irritation to something that looked almost like panic. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was listening, just not to her. On Friday night, she had her friend Diane over. They went through a bottle of wine in the kitchen while I watched a game in the other room with the volume low enough to hear the conversation bleed through the wall. I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose, but I stopped pretending I wasn't when I heard Diane's voice drop into that careful, wine-softened register people use when they're about to say something they probably shouldn't. You still haven't told him it was Troy? I didn't move, didn't breathe. Naomi said something low and fast that I couldn't catch. Diane's answer came through clearer. I'm just saying, if he finds out from someone else first. He won't. Naomi's voice, sharp and final. Drop it. I set my drink down on a coffee table. Slowly. The way you set something down when you don't trust your own hands. Troy. My third cousin Troy, who'd sat at my kitchen table 2 Thanksgivings ago and shook my hand and told me I had a great place. Who'd borrowed $300 from me 4 years back for a car repair and paid it back in installments like it was a formal loan because he said that's what men did. Who I defended to my mother when she said he was a little too smooth for his own good. I sat with that, named the way you sit with a diagnosis. Quiet. Still. Letting it settle into the correct compartment. After Diane left, Naomi came into the living room looking loose and careful at the same time. The way people look when they've had just enough wine to think they're more controlled than they are. Good night? She asked, reaching for the remote. Fine, I said. She sat at the other end of the couch, pulled a blanket over her legs. We watched 10 minutes of something neither of us was watching. Then I said, casually, without looking away from the screen, how's Troy doing these days? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. I felt her go rigid from 6 feet away. Fine, she said finally. I think. I haven't talked to him. I nodded like that was a perfectly satisfying response. She said nothing else. Neither did I. But I filed every detail, the half-second pause, the dropped eye contact, the way her hand stopped moving under the blanket. Evidence doesn't always come in documents. Sometimes it comes in a space between one word and the next. I waited until she went to bed. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and started writing down what I knew for certain, what I suspected, and what I needed to find out. Not because I'm dramatic, because that's how I work. You don't troubleshoot a failed system by going on feeling. You map the problem first. And the more I mapped it, the uglier the picture got. I started pulling at the calendar in my memory. The last 12 months, slowly, carefully, the way you peel back insulation to find the damaged line underneath. March. Naomi started going to Tuesday evening pottery class she never once showed me a single piece from. May. She was 40 minutes late to my buddy Curtis's cookout, flushed and apologetic, said she'd lost track of time running errands. July 4th weekend. She'd volunteered to pick up Troy from the airport when he visited, said it was on her way. It wasn't. August. She changed her phone passcode, said it was a security update. October. The argument. The sentence. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, counting up 12 months of small, explainable things that had just stopped being explainable. A year. The whole shape of it laid out in front of me like a blueprint for something I never agreed to build. I closed the notepad, put the cap on the pen. The marriage hadn't died the night she said those 6 words. It had been dying for a year while I was at work keeping other people's systems running. The sentence was just the moment the pressure gauge finally hit 0. I went to the guest room, lay down, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, I decided I'd call Curtis. Curtis Harmon has known me since we were 22 years old, working summer maintenance at the same industrial plant outside Columbus. He's the kind of man who doesn't fill silence with noise. You can sit with Curtis for an hour without either of you saying much, and walk away feeling like something got settled. That Saturday morning, I drove to his place in Worthington, and before I even had my jacket off, he handed me a mug and pointed at the kitchen table like he already knew this wasn't a social call. I told him everything. The argument. The sentence. Troy's name through the wall. The 12 months of small lies I've been reconstructing in my head like a machine someone had quietly been taking parts from. Curtis listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set down his mug and looked at me straight. "How long you been sitting on this alone?" he asked. "5 days," I said. He nodded slowly. "And what do you want to do about it?" That was the right question. "Now are you okay?" He could see I wasn't falling apart. "Now what happened?" He just heard it. "What do you want to do?" I appreciated that more than I could say. "I want to be ready before she knows I'm moving," I told him. Curtis leaned back in his chair. "Then you need 2 things. A lawyer and a plan. In that order." He gave me a name. Not from a billboard or a late-night commercial. From a conversation he'd had 3 years ago at a job site with a foreman who'd just come out the other side of a brutal divorce and kept everything he'd built. The attorney's name was Gerald Fitch. Office downtown, small practice, no flashy website. Curtis said the foreman described him as the kind of man who won quietly and completely. I called Monday morning. Had an appointment by Wednesday. Between those 2 points, I kept doing what I'd been doing, showing up to work, coming home, maintaining the surface. Naomi had settled into a cautious warmth, the kind that felt performed. She made my preferred dinners twice that week. Refilled my coffee without being asked. Laughed a little too readily at things I said. She was trying to rebuild something with small gestures, and I let her believe they were landing. Meanwhile, I was doing inventory of a different kind. Tuesday night, after she went to bed, I went through the filing cabinet in the second bedroom. The one she called the office, but mostly used for storing things we'd never dealt with. I pulled out the mortgage documents, both car titles, our joint account records going back 3 years, and the retirement plan statements. Spread them across the kitchen table and photographed every page with my phone. Then I found something I hadn't looked at in years. Our refinance agreement from 18 months ago. The one the bank had walked us through in about 20 minutes while Naomi kept checking her phone. Page 7, Clause 4.1. Property disposition in event of dissolution. I read it 3 times. She'd been in a hurry to sign that day. Said she had a lunch to get to. I put everything back exactly as I found it. Drove to a FedEx the next morning before my shift and printed 2 copies of everything. One set went into a folder I labeled equipment transfer records and locked in my toolbox at work. The other went into a padded envelope I mailed to Curtis with a text that just said, "Hold this for me." He replied with a single word, "Done." Wednesday afternoon, I walked into Gerald Fitch's office and sat across from a man in his early 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, a desk stacked with folders, and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every version of this situation and never once been surprised by it. I told him the short version. He asked 4 specific questions, took notes on a legal pad in handwriting so small I couldn't read it from across the desk, and then looked up at me over his glasses. "You haven't confronted her directly?" he confirmed. "No," I said. "Good. Don't. Not yet." He tapped his pen on the pad. People make mistakes when they're confronted. They move money. They delete things. They get defensive and start building a counter-narrative. Right now you have the advantage of positioning. Let's not waste it. He used a word I hadn't expected. Architecture. He said we were going to build a structure, clean, sound, load-bearing, so that when the moment came, she would have no wall left to lean on. I drove home that evening and pulled into the driveway to find Naomi's car already there, lights on inside. The smell of something cooking when I opened the door. She looked up from the stove with a smile that almost reached her eyes. "Good day." "Productive," I said, hanging up my jacket. She had no idea she'd just been outmaneuvered in a game. She thought she was still winning. It was Curtis who found out about Pamela. Not through any deep digging. Just the kind of lateral thinking you develop when you've spent 20 years solving mechanical problems. He knew Troy's situation through a mutual acquaintance, a guy named Vince who ran a parts supply warehouse south of Columbus and knew everyone's business without ever seeming to ask. Curtis called Vince on a Thursday, asked a few careful questions, and called me Friday morning before I left for work. "Troy's been married 3 years," Curtis said. "Wife's name is Pamela. And for what Vince tells me, she's not exactly in the dark." I sat in my truck in the driveway, engine idling. "She knows. Knows and stays," Curtis confirmed. "Vince says it's one of those arrangements where she's decided her situation is preferable to starting over. Nice house, joint income, she looks the other way. I thought about that for a moment. About Pamela in her nice house, deciding that was enough. I respected her right to make that choice. I just had absolutely no intention of making the same one myself. I want to talk to her, I said. Curtis paused. Preston, not to blow anything up, to let her know what her husband's been doing under my roof. With my wife. For a year. I kept my voice level. She deserves to know the full picture, even if she's already decided what to do with it. Curtis thought it over. I'll get your number. It took 2 days. I called Pamela on a Sunday afternoon from my truck, parked outside a hardware store 2 miles from the house. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was careful from the first word, the voice of someone who had learned to brace before answering. I introduced myself, said my name and my relation to Troy. There was a silence, then a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I was wondering if this call would happen eventually, she said. Then you know why I'm calling? I replied. I know, she admitted. Quiet. A little flat. I've known about this one for about 8 months. This one, I noted the phrasing. It said more than she probably intended. I'm not asking you to do anything, I told her. I just thought you should know it's been going on for a year, not however long he told you, and that it happened in my house. At my table. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, something tighter under it, something that sounded less like resignation and more like a door she'd been leaning against just got pushed from the other side. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. I mean that. We hung up. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, then drove home. I didn't know what Pamela would do with what I'd given her. That wasn't my responsibility, but I'd given her the complete truth, and that mattered to me. I wasn't the kind of man who withheld information from someone who had the right to it, even if her husband was the one who'd wronged us both. What I didn't anticipate was how fast it would move. By Tuesday, Troy had called Naomi twice. I knew because I'd set up a second phone, prepaid, registered to my work address, and used it to run a basic call log check on her home Wi-Fi. Nothing elaborate, just enough to see the incoming numbers. Troy's cell showed up at 6:47 p.m. and again at 9:13 p.m. Both calls were short. The second one lasted under a minute. That night, Naomi was distracted at dinner, pushing food around her plate, checking her phone under the table like she thought I wasn't watching. I ate my meal, asked about her week, and listened to her answers with the focused patience of a man who already knows more than he's showing. After dinner, I washed the dishes while she sat on the couch. At one point, she said, unprompted, "Have you talked to Troy lately?" I turned off the faucet and looked at her over my shoulder. "Not recently," I said. "Why?" She shrugged, eyes back on her phone. Just asking. Just asking." I turned the faucet back on and finished the dishes. Behind me, I heard her type something fast and then set the phone face down on the cushion. The sound of someone containing a situation, trying to stay ahead of something that was already behind her. Pamela had moved faster than I expected, and now the whole board was shifting. Good, I thought. Let's shift. I held it together for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of measured responses and careful silence, and letting Naomi believe the temperature in our house was slowly returning to normal. 3 weeks of documents and phone calls and quiet architecture. I was proud of that discipline. I'd built it deliberately, the same way you build containment around a pressure system. Methodical, reinforced, load-tested. But pressure systems fail. That's the one thing you learn early in my line of work. Not if, when. It happened on a Thursday evening. I'd come home from a 12-hour shift at the Hargrove plant, where a secondary boiler had thrown a fault code at 4 in the morning, and I'd spent the better part of the day crawling through a maintenance shaft that smelled like burning insulation. I was exhausted in the specific, bone-deep way that doesn't respond to sitting down. I just wanted food, quiet, and 8 hours of sleep. Naomi was on the phone when I walked in. She was leaning against the kitchen counter with her back to the door, laughing. A real laugh, not the careful social laugh she'd been using around me. And she didn't hear me come in over the sound of her own voice. I know, she was saying, bright and easy. He's been in this weird, quiet phase. It's actually kind of nice, honestly. I stood in the hallway. Jacket still on, keys in hand. She turned and saw me. The laugh stopped like someone had cut a wire. She said a quick goodbye into the phone and set it face down on the counter. "Hey," she offered. "Didn't hear you come in." "Clearly," I replied. walking past her toward the refrigerator. She followed. Long day. Yeah. I made chicken, she added, gesturing at the stove. It's still warm. I pulled out a container of leftovers instead, set it on the counter, started looking for a fork, and that's when she did it. She reached across me, opened the wrong drawer, and said in that bright, redirecting tone she used when she wanted to control the temperature of a room, "That's the thing about you, Preston. You always make things harder than they need to be." I stopped. Something in my chest that had been compressed for 3 solid weeks shifted loose all at once, and I turned around and looked at her with an expression I hadn't shown her in a long time. "Harder than they need to be," I repeated. Quiet. Dangerously quiet. She must have heard something in my voice, because she took a half step back. "I just meant. I know what you meant." My voice rose, and I let it. "You meant that if I just swallow everything quietly and go back to being the guy who fixes the cabinet and pretends not to notice, things would be easier. Easier for you." "Preston, calm down." "I'm not going to calm down." I set the fork on the counter hard enough that it rang against the tile. "You told me you were in love with someone else. You said those words in this kitchen, standing right where you're standing now. And then 2 minutes later, you were chasing me down the hallway telling me you made it up. Which is it, Naomi? Because it can't be both." "I explained that," she started. "You explained nothing." My voice filled the room, and she flinched. Not from fear, from the shock of it. 3 weeks of calm had made her forget what it looked like when I stopped containing myself. "You handed me a grenade and then asked me to act like it wasn't live. You've been walking around here making chicken and pouring my coffee like everything is fine while I've been carrying around the name Troy for 3 weeks. The silence that dropped after that word was absolute. Naomi's face went white. Not pale white. Her mouth opened, then shut. "That's right," I said, quieter now, chest still heaving. "I know the name. I know it's not nothing. And I know it's been going on a lot longer than one argument." She pressed her back against the counter like she needed something solid behind her. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter how." I picked up the fork, pointed it briefly in her direction, not threatening, just punctuating, and set it back down. "What matters is that you looked me in the face every single morning for a year, and you smiled, and you handed me coffee, and you let me think we were fine. That's not a mistake. That's a decision." Her eyes were filling, but I was past the point where that moved me. I turned away, picked up my container of leftovers, and walked to the other end of the kitchen. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the physical cost of finally releasing 3 weeks of compression. I stood with my back to her and focused on breathing. Behind me, I heard her make a sound, low and broken, like the beginning of a sob she was trying to swallow. "Preston," she said softly. "I'm sorry." I didn't answer right away, just stood there until my hands steadied. Then I turned around and looked at her, really looked, the way you look at something you're trying to memorize before it's gone. "I know you are," I said, "but sorry doesn't rebuild what you spent a year taking apart." I took my food to the guest room and closed the door. I didn't slam it. That would have meant I still needed her to hear me. I didn't. I'd said what needed saying, and I'd meant every word, and now that pressure was out, I could think clearly again. I sat on the edge of the bed and ate cold leftovers in the dark. My hands had stopped shaking. My mind was running clean and fast and focused, the way it did after a hard shift when everything that wasn't essential had been burned away. I thought about Gerald Fitch, about page 7, clause 4.1, about the envelope sitting in Curtis's spare room. The architecture was still standing. I just needed to blow off some steam before the next phase. Tomorrow, I decided, things would start moving faster. I gave Naomi 2 days of cold normal. Not hostile, just distant and functional, the way 2 strangers share a waiting room. I watched her process the outburst the way I'd watched pressurized equipment release, initially chaotic, then settling, then going still as the new reality calibrated itself. She stopped trying to recapture warmth, started being careful instead, measuring her words before she used them. Good. Careful was manageable. Careful meant she was starting to understand stakes. On Saturday morning, she went to her friend Diane's place, and I made the call I'd been planning since the night of the argument. I had her parents' number from the family contact list on our shared Google account, the same account I'd already quietly backed up and saved offline. Her father, Raymond Stokes, was a retired corrections officer from Zanesville, old school in the truest sense, a man who believed that if you gave your word, you kept it, and if you made a promise, you honored it, even when it cost you something. I called him at 10 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring with his usual directness. "Preston, everything all right?" "Not entirely, Raymond," I said. I'd thought carefully about how to do this, not as a weapon, not as a performance, but as one honest man talking to another. "I need to tell you something, and I want to be straight with you, because I've always respected how you operate." He went quiet in the way men like Raymond go quiet, completely, attentively, without filling the space. I told him the basics. The argument, the sentence, the name Troy, the 12 months of evidence I'd reconstructed. I told him I wasn't calling to start a war or ask him to pick sides. I told him I was calling because he deserved to know the truth about what was happening in his daughter's marriage before it became a public matter. When I finished, Raymond was silent for a long moment. "Troy," he said finally. The word came out flat and heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. "Your people's Troy." "Yes, sir." Another silence. Then, quietly, "How long have you known?" "A few weeks," I said, "but it's been going on for about a year." I heard him exhale, the slow, controlled breath of a man who had spent decades keeping his composure under pressure and wasn't about to stop now. "I appreciate you calling me directly," he said. "That took something." "You raised her," I replied simply. "You had the right to know." We spoke for another few minutes, nothing specific, nothing that felt like strategizing, and then said goodbye. Raymond's voice, when he signed off, was quieter than it had started. Heavier. I knew what was coming. Not because I'd engineered it, but because I knew Raymond Stokes and a man like that didn't sit on something like this. Naomi called me at noon. I was in the garage working on my truck when my phone buzzed on the workbench. I let it ring, then listened to the voicemail. Her voice was tight, controlled, and underneath the control was something shaking. "My dad called me. I don't know what you said to him, but he is furious. Preston, he wants me to come to Zanesville this weekend. My mother is barely speaking to me." A pause. "I don't know what you're doing, but this is between us. You didn't have to involve my family." I set the phone back on the workbench and went back to work. She was home by 2 o'clock, walked into the garage, and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set, eyes red for what had clearly been a difficult phone call with her parents. "Why would you do that?" she demanded. I set down my wrench and turned to face her, leaning back against the truck. "Because your father is an honest man, and he deserved the truth. That was private. So was our marriage." I shot back, evenly. "That didn't stop you." She pressed her lips together, and I watched her struggle to find the angle that worked. She'd lost the moral high ground weeks ago. Now she was trying to find a foothold on the practical argument. This is a family matter. It stays in the house. But that argument assumed I was still invested in protecting her reputation. I wasn't. "My father called me a coward," she said, and for a second her voice lost all its armor. Just a woman who'd just heard something from her father she couldn't unhear. I felt something, not satisfaction, not cruelty, just the quiet weight of a consequence arriving at its natural destination. "What did you say back?" I asked. She didn't answer, looked at the floor instead. "Naomi," I said, and waited until she looked up. "The truth doesn't stop being true because you'd prefer it stayed private. You made choices. This is what choices look like when they come full circle." She left the garage without another word. I picked up my wrench, went back to the truck, and worked until the light started to fade. From inside the house I heard, once, the muffled sound of her crying on the phone. Her mother, probably. Or Diane. I turned on my radio and kept working. Gerald Fitch had given me one standing instruction: stay predictable. Same schedule, same habits, same face at home. Don't give her a reason to get defensive and start moving things around. I'd followed that to the letter for weeks. I left for work at the same time every morning, came home within the same 30-minute window every evening, and kept the surface of our marriage polished enough that Naomi had no idea how much had shifted underneath it. That Thursday, I had a short day. A site inspection out in Reynoldsburg wrapped up 2 hours ahead of schedule. The client signed off without revisions, and I was pulling out of their parking lot by 2:15. a full 3 hours before I was normally home. I thought about driving around, killing time, maintaining the schedule the way Fitch had advised. I decided against it. I was tired of manufacturing normal. I pulled into our street at 2:40 and noticed Troy's truck immediately. Dark blue, extended cab, the one with the cracked left taillight he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. Parked 2 houses down, not in our driveway, not directly in front. Tucked back a little. The parking choice of a man who knew he shouldn't be there. I sat in my truck for about 30 seconds. Then I got out, walked up the front path, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. They were in the living room. Naomi on the couch, Troy in the armchair closest to the window, both of them with drinks, both of them looking at each other with an easiness that told me this wasn't the first afternoon they'd spent this way. The moment they heard the door, Troy was on his feet like a man who'd been rehearsing an exit. Naomi's drink hit the coffee table hard. Troy looked at me with the expression of a man whose entire internal system had just gone into emergency shutdown. Eyes wide, face pale, shoulders pulled back toward the wall behind him. Then Naomi started screaming. Not crying, not explaining. Screaming, full volume, hands up, voice filling the room like she was trying to drown out whatever was about to happen with sheer noise. What are you doing home? You don't just walk in here. This is not okay. Preston, you can't just show up early and act like, get out. I mean it. You need to leave right now. This is my house, too. I stood in the doorway and looked at her. Then I looked at Troy, who had pressed himself against the far wall with the posture of a man who desperately wanted to become part of the wallpaper. And then I laughed. Not a short, ironic exhale. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deep when something is simultaneously too absurd and too perfectly timed to treat any other way. I stood there in my own living room, jacket still on, keys in hand.
I'm sorry, but I have to stop right here, because she is screaming at her own husband to get out of his own house, and all he does is laugh. Honestly, that right there is the most powerful thing a man can do, because she expected rage, and he gave her nothing she could use.
And I laughed while my wife screamed at me for coming home. Naomi's voice climbed higher. Don't you laugh at me. I'm serious. This is not funny. You need to leave this house right now. This is my house, Naomi, I said, still almost smiling, my voice completely calm beneath her volume. I pay the mortgage on it. You want someone to leave, you're looking at the wrong person. Troy had been inching sideways toward the hallway like he was hoping I'd forget he existed. I looked at him directly, and he froze. Troy, I said. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. You don't have to say anything, I told him quieter now. I already know everything worth knowing. But I want you to look at me and understand something. I'll let a beat pass. You sat at my table. You shook my hand. You borrowed money from me and paid it back in installments because you said that was the honorable thing to do. I'll let the word land. You should think hard about that word. His jaw worked. His eyes were still wide. He looked, honestly, like a man who was hoping the floor would do him a favor. Naomi had gone quiet during that exchange. The screaming had shut off the moment I stopped reacting to it, and now she was watching me with something that wasn't anger anymore. It was closer to dread. Troy picked up his keys from the side table. Didn't look at either of us as he moved toward the door. I stepped aside, held it open. He walked out without a word, and I closed the door behind him, not gently this time. The frame shook. Naomi stood in the living room, arms wrapped around herself. Preston, we'll talk tomorrow, I said, walking past her toward the bedroom. Not tonight. You can't just. Tomorrow, Naomi. I closed the bedroom door. This time I didn't hear her follow. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a long moment, hands on my knees. The laugh had been real, but underneath it had been something heavier that I didn't let surface in front of her. That was the rule. Whatever happened inside, nothing useful came from putting it on display. I took out my phone and texted Curtis 2 words. It's time. He replied in under a minute. Fitch tomorrow? I typed back, first thing. Then I set the phone on the nightstand and lay back on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. In the living room, after a long silence, I heard Naomi sit back down on the couch. Heard her pick up her phone. Heard her start talking in a low, urgent voice that she thought I couldn't hear. She was running out of runway, and she didn't know it yet. I met with Gerald Fitch Friday morning. Walked him through what had happened. Troy in the living room, the screaming, the whole scene, and he listened without changing his expression. When I finished, he nodded once, made a note, and told me the timeline was now our friend. She's rattled, he said. Rattled people make moves. Let's make sure every move she makes is one we've already accounted for. We finalized the next sequence over the following 4 days. Fitch handled the legal architecture quietly and precisely, the way he described at our first meeting. By Tuesday, the paperwork was in order, property transfer documentation built on the refinance clause she'd signed without reading, account separation filings, a clean and complete asset inventory. He said it with characteristic calm. She'll see the structure only after it's already weight-bearing. On Wednesday evening, I came home from work to find Naomi out. She'd texted that she was having dinner with Diane. I had approximately 2 hours. I went straight to the second bedroom closet, pulled out the 4 storage boxes I'd staged there over the previous week, and started moving through the house. I wasn't careful about it. I wasn't folding things or packing them neatly. I opened Naomi's closet and pulled clothes out by the armful, hangers and all, and pushed them into boxes without separating them. Shoes went in loose, on top of whatever was already there. The decorative items on her vanity, the perfume collection she'd been building for years, the jewelry organizer, the framed photo of her and Diane from a trip to Savannah. All of it went in without ceremony or sorting. I moved fast and without sentiment. She'd had a year to treat this house like it meant something. I was past the point of treating her things like they did. The boxes went to the front hallway. 4 of them, stacked too high. Her life compressed into cardboard without apology. I didn't leave a note, didn't arrange them neatly, just set them by the door like freight. Then I walked to the kitchen, made a sandwich, and sat down to eat it. She came home at 9. I heard the front door open, heard her stop, heard the silence stretch out as she processed what she was looking at. Then she appeared in the kitchen doorway. "What is this?" Her voice was tight and low. "Your things," I said, not looking up from my plate. "You pack my things." "Loosely speaking, yes." She stepped into the kitchen. "Preston, you can't just." "I didn't touch anything that was jointly ours," I said, cutting her off cleanly. "The joint items stay until the paperwork says otherwise. What's in those boxes is yours. I'd make arrangements." Her voice went up. "You don't get to decide when I leave my own home." I set down my sandwich and looked at her levelly. "Naomi, you brought another man into this house, into our living room, on a Wednesday afternoon." I kept my voice even, each word placed like a tool going back on a shelf. "You don't get to tell me what I get to decide about this house anymore." That privilege left with Troy. Her mouth tightened. Tears came, the real kind this time, I could tell, but she held them back through what looked like genuine effort. "I have nowhere to go on short notice," she said. "Diane has a spare room," I replied. "You were just at her house." She looked at the boxes, then at me, then back at the boxes, calculating, hoping for a lever she didn't have. "I want to talk to someone," she said finally. "A counselor. Both of us." "You should absolutely talk to someone," I told her, standing up and taking my plate to the sink. I genuinely encouraged that. I rinsed the plate and set it in the rack. As for both of us, that conversation should go through our attorneys at this point. She exhaled like something had collapsed inside her. "You've already talked to a lawyer." "I have," I said simply. "And they're very good." I dried my hands, walked past her to the hallway, paused at the stack of boxes, looked back at her once, at the woman I'd spent 11 years building a life with, who had spent 1 year quietly dismantling it. "I'm not angry," I told her, and I meant it, "but I'm done." I went to the guest room and closed the door. Outside, after a long time, I heard her moving. The sound of a box being lifted, the front door opening, then closing, then opening again. She was making arrangements. Naomi moved into Diane's spare room 11 days after the boxes appeared in the hallway. She took what she could fit in her car that first night and came back twice more with Diane's SUV. Each time I was either at work or in the garage, and each time she moved through the house quickly and quietly, like someone who had finally accepted the new geography of things. On the 14th day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, professional and clipped, identifying herself as Dana Hollister, attorney at law, representing Naomi Turner in the matter of marital dissolution. She wanted to schedule an initial four-way meeting, both parties, both attorneys, within the week. I wrote down the name, thanked her politely, and called Gerald Fitch before I'd even pulled out of the parking lot. She moved first, I told him. Good, Fitch said without hesitation. It means she's scared and working from a reactive position. What's the attorney's name? I told him. There was a brief pause. Dana Hollister, he repeated. Aggressive, theatrical, good at making noise. Another pause. She's never beaten me. We met 4 days later in a conference room downtown. Neutral ground, a rented space with a long table and no windows. Naomi sat across from me for the first time since she'd finished removing her things, and she looked composed in the careful, constructed way of someone who had spent the morning building armor. Dana Hollister sat beside her, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a leather portfolio she opened before anyone else had settled. Hollister opened with a property claim framed around Naomi's 11 years of domestic contribution, followed by a spousal support argument built on income disparity. She delivered it smoothly and watched me across the table as she spoke, clearly gauging whether the presentation was landing. I kept my face neutral. Under the table, I had my copy of the refinance agreement open to page 7, clause 4.1. When she finished, Fitch opened his folder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He simply began laying documents on the table, one at a time, like a man setting tools on a workbench before a job he'd already completed in his head. The refinance clause, the primary income documentation, the asset transfer paperwork, already filed, the account separation, already processed. 3 years of financial records showing the consistent and documented structure of household funding. By the time Fitch reached the 4th document, Hollister had stopped writing. By the 6th, Naomi was looking at the table instead of at me. The structure is already built, Fitch said pleasantly, stacking his documents back into the folder. We're not here to negotiate the foundation. We're here to discuss the terms of transition within it. Hollister asked for 2 weeks to review. Fitch gave her one. I drove home that afternoon and sat in the driveway for a few minutes. The house felt different from the outside now, not smaller, just more honestly itself. A building with a value and a deed and a mortgage I'd paid 90% of, instead of the projected backdrop of a life I'd been performing in. I went inside, changed clothes, and drove to the coffee shop on 5th Street where I'd started going in the mornings after Naomi left. It was quiet, good light, a counter by the window where you could sit with a cup and not be required to be anything in particular. The woman at the end of the counter looked up when I sat down. She'd been there twice before. I'd noticed her the way you notice someone who takes up the right amount of space without trying to fill all of it. Dark hair, reading glasses pushed up on her head, a paperback open face down beside her coffee. You're the regular who orders the dark roast and stares at the window, she said. Guilty, I replied. Isla, she offered, extending a hand. Preston, I said and shook it. She went back to her book. I went back to my coffee. We sat in comfortable quiet for 20 minutes, and somewhere in that quiet something settled in me. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the simple recognition of what peace actually felt like when it wasn't being maintained by effort. I left first, not on my way out. She nodded back. It wasn't a beginning yet, but it wasn't nothing either. The divorce finalized on a Thursday in late January, 8 weeks after that first four-way meeting. Naomi received her car, her personal belongings, and a settlement figure Fitch described as fair, proportionate, and final. The house stayed with me. The retirement account stayed with me. The joint account had already been separated 4 months prior. Hollister filed 2 countermotions in the final stretch. Fitch dispatched both of them without drama and billed me for 4 hours. Naomi signed everything on a Tuesday afternoon. I wasn't in the room. Fitch handled it, and he called me afterward with the same unhurried manner he used for everything. It's done, he said. Clean. Complete. Thank you, Gerald, I told him, and I meant it fully. That evening Curtis came over with a 6-pack, and we sat on the back porch in the cold and didn't say much. At one point, he raised his can and said, "You handled that like a man." I raised mine back, and that was the whole ceremony. Troy disappeared from the family landscape with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood he'd used up every benefit of the doubt he was ever going to get. Pamela left him 2 months after my phone call. Not because I'd asked her to, but because the full picture, once seen clearly, apparently looked different than the partial one she'd been living with. I heard this through Curtis, who heard it through Vince. I didn't follow up. It wasn't my chapter. Naomi moved to a rental in Westerville. Her parents, particularly her father Raymond, had not, from what I understood, returned to the warmth they'd had with her before that phone call. Some things realign when the truth comes out, and not everything realigns back. On the last Friday of February, I went to the coffee shop on 5th Street. Isla was at the counter. Same spot, same glasses on her head, different book. She looked up when I came in, and something in her expression said she'd noticed the absence of whatever weight I'd been carrying the last few times. "You look different," she said. "Better or worse?" I asked, sitting down. She considered it with the seriousness the question deserved. "Lighter," she decided. "I order my dark roast." She closed her book. We talked for an hour about her work as a physical therapist, about boiler systems, and why I'd chosen a trade over an office, about the particular satisfaction of fixing something that was broken and having it hold. At some point, she laughed at something I said, a real laugh without any performance in it, and I thought, there it is. That's the sound of something that doesn't need maintenance to stay running. I asked if she wanted to have dinner sometime. She said yes without deliberating over it. I drove home through the February cold with the heat on and the radio low, and I thought about 11 years and what they'd built and what they'd cost, and about what it meant to come out the other side of something like that, still standing, still whole, still capable of sitting across from someone new and feeling genuinely curious about what came next. The house was quiet when I got home. Just mine. The right kind of quiet. Not the absence of something lost, but the presence of something earned. I didn't have a word for what was starting with Isla. Didn't need one yet. I just knew that for the first time in a long time, I was walking towards something instead of managing something falling apart.
Some people mistake a quiet man for a weak one. Preston never raised his voice to demand respect. He simply stopped giving access to anyone who hadn't earned it. And in the end, that's what real strength looks like. Thank you for listening to this story. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.